Landlords in Illinois were trapped in a system where they couldn't get any rental assistance money, but were unable to evict horrible tenants who weren't paying rent. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the fact that the emergency rental assistance programs that were put in place throughout the country did not work. Okay, there were so many landlords who they had tenants who weren't paying rent, but they didn't qualify for the emergency rental assistance, yet for some reason the state and local government still wouldn't allow those people to be evicted for not paying the rent. So landlords ended up just taking these huge losses, and this happened everywhere, not just in the coastal areas. And the story I'm covering today is actually out of Illinois. So obviously Illinois is a much more progressive leaning place, even though it's in the Midwest, but it still shouldn't be this way, okay? It shouldn't be that landlords, they got stuck with the bill for housing a bunch of people who didn't want to pay the rent, okay? That was my big gripe with all of this. It was obviously a Fifth Amendment violation to anybody who can read the plain language of the Constitution. An unconstitutional taking of private property for public use without just compensation. And when you take away the emergency rental assistance and the landlord's ability to get that, yet you tell them that they can't evict the tenant, regardless of whether the tenant qualifies for that rental assistance, well, guess what? There's no just compensation right there. So it's a pretty simple thing to me. So, it blows my mind that these cases haven't made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where these state and local municipalities who put this stuff in place aren't just getting ripped apart, ripped to shreds, because it's obviously unconstitutional. Anyway, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? Have you heard of cases anywhere where you live or invest where landlords, weren't able to get compensated for their total losses during the whole eviction moratorium nonsense? Now, I know in a lot of places it ended earlier than in other places, right? But I know there were a lot of landlords out there who were never made whole and are still, just thousands of dollars in the hole. Okay, they lost thousands of dollars in lost rent and whatever costs that they incurred. So yeah, I'm just not happy. I'm not satisfied with the way a lot of these programs turned out. So anyway, this article is coming from AdvantageNews.com, and it says, "Emergency rent relief bypasses deserving landlords," Illinois group says. Yeah, and they are absolutely right. And this article actually covers why they are right. So let me get into it. Nearly $1.02 billion in emergency rental relief was given out in round 2 of the Illinois Rental Payment Program for COVID relief, but many landlords were left without much recourse or help. The goals of the program were worthy, said Paul Arena, Director of Legislative Affairs for the Illinois Rental Property Owners Association. There was an unprecedented crisis. The problem for IRPOA is that thousands of landlords wound up getting no rent relief. The Illinois Housing Development Authority announced that of more than 64,000 applications, about 27,000 were approved for the second round of the federally funded program. The average level of assistance was nearly $7,500. For applicants who did not have a responding landlord, about 3,100 were approved for direct payments for a total of $25 million, an increase of $15 million from the first round of the program for tenants without a responding landlord. So basically, they gave tenants a free payout, right? And they said right here that they gave 3,100 tenants direct payments because they said the landlord didn't respond. Okay, think about that for a moment. You told a bunch of tenants that, hey, you don't have to pay your rent, right? For however long the eviction moratoriums in Illinois lasted, right? So let's say it was a year, just as an example, just to make this easy, right? So you don't have to pay any rent for a full year. Not only that, right, but you cannot be evicted, and we're going to send you a check for the thousands of dollars in rent that you owe, and you don't have to pay that to your landlord, because even if you don't pay it to the landlord still can't evict you. What kind of moron thought this was a good idea? So obviously there were a lot of tenants who were taking advantage of this sort of situation. A lot of landlords got left out in the dust and ended up being the homeless shelter and social housing provider for a bunch of freeloading people who, had all this government money given directly to them. They said right there 3,100 tenants who got the money directly. Who says those tenants paid anything to their landlords? I'd be willing to bet that most of them didn't pay anything, not one penny. Okay, so even though there were those 3,100, then the other issue is, right, they said that they took 64,000 applications, but they only paid 27,000 landlords. So you do the math, right? It's pretty simple. Less than half of all the people who applied actually got rental assistance. So that means there are, tens of thousands, and this is just in Illinois, who did not even get one dime of rental assistance through their program. So yeah, there were a lot of landlords left out hanging. And they kind of go into more detail about why a little bit further down. At the same time, for more than a year, Illinois prevented landlords from evicting non-paying tenants. The dollar amount of the rental assistance that was given out is huge, but it did not cover all the losses to housing providers, Arena told Center Square. That shows the magnitude of the damage that was done by these policies. He believes landlords should have had the ability to go to court and get a judge to decide whether or not a tenant was experiencing a COVID-related hardship. Instead, landlords were left with no recourse. So yeah, basically, it was up to the tenant to self-verify that they were experiencing a COVID-related hardship, and that's why they weren't paying rent. Well, of course, to the tenant, whether they lost their job or not, whether they experienced any actual, additional bills or not, they're going to say, yeah, I'm experiencing COVID hardship. And they don't have to explain it to anybody. They don't have to prove it. So the tenant should have had to, basically apply, is what this landlord group is saying. Now, I don't believe in eviction moratoriums at all, right? So my personal opinion is, hey, this shouldn't have been put in place at all. But you know what? I understand the perspective of this landlord. Okay, well, it is in place, right? So since it is in place and we can't change that fact, then the tenant should have been forced to, prove that they actually needed these protections. During 2020 and 2021, thousands of Illinois households experienced severe health impacts, including deaths of breadwinners and devastating economic losses when businesses shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The state used federal tax funds to provide rental assistance. After the applications were screened to ensure the assistance would only go to people who were suffering from COVID-related hardships, IHDA approved 27,279 applications. Therein lies the problem, Arena said. He asks, what happened to the landlords of the 37,163 tenants whose applications were rejected by the government relief program? Arena believes that many of them wound up stuck with non-paying tenants that they were prohibited by law from evicting. So yeah, after the government went through and they were like, hey, we're not going to give these COVID relief funds unless you qualify for the protections, right? And they said, okay, well, of the 64,000 people that we had apply, only these 27,000 actually qualify for the rental assistance, right? But at the same time, whether the people qualified for the rental assistance or not, they were protected by the eviction moratorium. The landlords were unable to evict them, and they ended up stuck with these freeloaders living in their properties. So yeah, this is a huge problem. It's nice to see that this property owners association is pointing it out. The unfortunate fact is, though, that there are going to be no consequences for the tenants. There's going to be no consequences for the politicians who put this nonsense in place. And the only ones who ended up suffering overall are going to be the landlords, So this is why I always say, be very careful in the places where you're investing, because you know what? These laws they put in place, these rules they put in place, and these regulations they put in place, they are going to, slowly eat you alive in places where, they're extremely left-leaning and progressive and anti-landlord and anti-property rights. Because the eviction moratorium went on for 15 months, many landlords experienced thousands of dollars in losses. Arena believes that hundreds, maybe even thousands, were unable to keep up with their mortgage payments. Those landlords need to be made whole, Arena said. Arena owns 62 units of rental housing in Rockford. He prides himself on the diversity of his tenant population. He also takes pride in the careful credit screening he does before he gives a new tenant a lease. During COVID, 5 of his tenants applied for and received several months of rental assistance. One tenant had her rent paid by IHDA throughout both phases of Illinois COVID emergency assistance rent relief time period, he said. Other members of the Illinois Rental Property Association did not fare as well. Some of their tenants failed to file the necessary paperwork and provide the required documentation to qualify for assistance. Some applied for relief and were not able to prove to IHDA screeners that they had experienced COVID hardships that met government criteria. Yeah, and those are all very, very good points right there. Okay, so if you have a tenant living in your property, they're unable to prove that they actually qualify, whether they do or not, or whether they experienced hardship or not, and you're unable to evict them. What are we supposed to do? Okay, so yeah, I had big issues with the rental assistance program, and I will tell you right now, yes, I did have tenants who applied and received rental assistance. So I did get some of the rental assistance money here for some of my tenants in Omaha, right? But if it came down to it again, where a pandemic or something like this happened again, I would much rather there be no eviction moratoriums in place and not have to jump through the hoops that the government asks for in order to get that little nugget of money, okay? And instead just be able to tell the tenants that, hey, you if you don't pay, you got to go, okay?